For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicola Davis and I'm the Vice Treasurer of Gray's Inn. May I welcome you all here this evening. A particular welcome to our friends from Cambridge, the Mock Trial Group. Good to see you here. I hope you've had an enjoyable and interesting day at this, the Best Inn. I'm particularly pleased to welcome this evening my fellow bencher of Gray's Inn, Professor Elwen Evans, Queen's Counsel. She is going to speak at this mixed messes. Professor Evans, like myself, is Welsh and proud of it. Professor Evans read law at Girton College, Cambridge, graduating with no less than a double first. She was called to the bar in 1980 and was appointed Queen's Counsel in 2002. Professor Evans enjoyed a varied and successful career at the bar, choosing to practice mainly in Wales. Her work, particularly in silk, included many serious, complex and high-profile cases in the area of criminal law. Professor Evans sits as a recorder in the Crown Court and for many years was head of chambers at Iscoy Chambers in Swansea. It was in 2015 that she made the interesting and I must say exciting move to take up the appointment as head of the College of Law and Criminology at Swansea University. She has since been instrumental in the growth of the department and its transformation into the Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law. It really has become one of the success stories within academe in Wales. Professor Evans presently holds the position of Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Executive Dean for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Swansea University. She also holds the university portfolio for Welsh language and culture. Professor Evans served as a commissioner on the Commission for Justice in Wales, which was chaired by Lord Thomas of Cwmgyrdd, a former Lord Chief Justice. She recently chaired a review into riots in Swansea. In 2018, she was in the top 10, celebrating 100 of Wales's most inspirational women. And her contribution to law in Wales has been recognised in the honour conferred upon her in becoming a member of the Gorsedd. And for those of us like Tom who know all about the Gorsedd, it is, if I may say so, a significant and singular honour. I have had the good fortune to see Professor Evans in action, both at the bar and at Swansea University. Hers is a formidable presence marked by intellect, enthusiasm, and a desire for justice in its broadest sense. We are fortunate that she has found time in what is a seriously busy schedule to speak this evening. Elwen, we welcome you.
How am I going to start? I could say that I don't recognize that description of me, and most people who know me won't recognize it either. So far as I'm concerned, I'm Elwen. I will in a moment say how grateful I am to the Inn, and I am going to ask if there are any Girtonians in the room, put your hand up. Oh, I thought that was the case. Anyway, so how do I start? How shall I stand? Folded arms? Hands in pockets? Where shall I stand? Behind the podium? In front of the podium? Because the podium's a bit of a barrier between me and you. Will I use detailed notes? Or shall I try to impress you all by talking from the back of a fag packet? Strange way to start, I know. But being an advocate is a dialogue. a dialogue with yourself around these sorts of decisions. How am I going to start? What am I going to say? How am I going to say it? But it's also a dialogue with your audience, whether that's in a courtroom, whether that's in these very hallowed environs of Gray's Inn. It's a dialogue with yourself. It's a dialogue with your audience. And sometimes even the best laid plans go wrong. Even my notes decided to float off to the floor. How do I engage with you? I've dropped my notes on the floor. I've said that I don't recognize that really, and thank you so much, Vice Treasurer, for that wonderful description of someone who may or may not be me. But what I want to do today is just to share with you a few reflections. And I use the word reflection very carefully because what I hope that ultimately we can share together is that question of the reflective advocate. How do I want to engage with you? Well, I'd probably prefer not to have dropped a piece of paper on the floor because that doesn't look very professional, does it? Do I want to try and impress you with flamboyant, stylistic fireworks? Or do I want us to have an unpretentious, downbeat chat? Although I suspect you will all know that the emotional histrionic style of the past is well out of favour, and it's been replaced by a much more pared down, understated style. But the choice of how we engage, the impression that one wants to seek to make, the objective that one is looking for, all of that will influence the style, the vocabulary, the manner, the approach that we as reflective advocates take. So I start in that slightly strange way by hoping to provoke that thought of every time you stand somewhere, every time you are in a courtroom, every time you're addressing an audience, where are you pitching it? How are you pitching it? What is your purpose? The most important thing I'd like to say at this stage is an enormous thank you. Thank you for the privilege, and I don't use the word lightly, of being invited to deliver this talk. It is a real honour for me because 40 plus years ago, I was sitting many times where you are sitting, dining, for the privilege of working towards being a member of this inn. And I am enormously indebted, financially, also emotionally, to this inn. I received the honour of a Mould Scholarship. That must be about 1980 or before. And so it gave me a start in a career which I have loved. And there is so much that I would like to share that one of my biggest problems, and I'm going to ask that a very close eye is kept on the clock up there and that signals and signs are made when I am overstaying my welcome. And please don't say that I've already done that. So, am I nervous? Yes, I am. I don't want to let anyone down. I don't think there's anything wrong in being nervous. I have a very high regard for the Vice Treasurer, for Master Alex Carlyle. In fact, and this is a whole story in itself, I would not have been a barrister, I wouldn't have come to the bar, were it not for seeing Master Carlyle in action in Mould Crown Court in about 1975. I'm sorry if we're sharing ages around this, but it was seeing advocacy as it was displayed powerfully, effectively by Lord Carlisle and by, in fact, Master Martin Thomas in a trial. It was a rape trial. I often don't remember what trial I did last week, but I remember that trial. It was a rape trial. It was a student who'd come over from Australia, and it was watching advocacy in that courtroom that led me to this career. So, yes, I'm nervous because I don't want to let people who I really respect down. And one of those iterative balances that is at the heart of advocacy, and one of those balances that you will need to develop and reflect upon, is that balance between confidence, because you've got to appear confident in court. There's no point in going into court and your client thinking, my goodness, this is someone who doesn't know what they're doing. So you've got to be confident. And overconfidence, which turns over, or can all too easily turn over into arrogance. And that is a complete turn-off, whatever your tribunal or audience. So these are the sorts of reflective decisions that you, in deciding, how will I start? What am I going to say? How am I going to say it? Will need to come to views upon in terms of your own voice. With my academic hat on, what is the learning outcome that I hope we will share tonight? Well, I hope you enjoy the evening. I hope you may pick up some pointers along the way, although probably from speaking to your mess colleagues rather than listening to me. But fundamentally, I hope that I will encourage you to embed reflection into your advocacy. Not a reflection that paralyzes you, a reflection that helps you to grow as considered and considerate advocates. I use the words advisedly, who are confident and comfortable in your own skins. I know that as student barristers, you will have a wonderful richness of advocacy training and development opportunities. It was not ever thus. I'm afraid in my time it was right, go on out there and get on with it. And if you fall flat on your face, well, you may learn something from that. But that, thank goodness, is not the world we're in now. I was looking at some emails from my law school today, and I was just seeing a summary of some of the training opportunities that students now have. There were mooting competitions, client interviewing competitions, negotiations competitions, mediation competitions, mock trial competitions. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the bar is not a competitive profession. And the one I particularly love was the legal triathlon. I have no idea what that is, but it sounds like something I'd like to get involved in. Formal advocacy training, and this clearly is not formal advocacy training, but that needs to be structured with clear do's and don'ts. And many books have been written on advocacy, some perhaps more compelling than others. But ultimately, what training, what books, what lectures are ways of promoting reflection. How am I going to deal with this? What am I going to do about it? Enabling you to reflect on your practice. And all experience, all reflection, good, bad, or indifferent, pedagogical or on the job, is key to developing your voice as advocates. There will be, I am sure, as many views of good advocacy as there are advocates in this room. In fact, I suspect there will be more views of good advocacy than there are advocates in this room, because our views change and develop over time. I did pupillage in a commercial set at Brick Court, but I then took a very positive decision that I wanted to return to Wales and I wanted to practice in a common law context. I specialised in criminal work as the years went by, and most of my trial work has been in front of juries. But most of what I have to say this evening applies to all kinds of work, whether oral, written, criminal, civil. The purpose of advocacy is the same: to present the case you are being paid to present. And I'm using those terms carefully, and I'll come back to that. To present the case you are being paid to present as compellingly as possible within the ethical framework of our proud profession. So the title of tonight, Anything You Do Say, Make Advocacy Matter. What does it mean? Well, the words, as you all know, anything you do say, are taken from the police caution. Even now, there is a recognition that words matter, even in that police caution. Anything you do say. Just one of those little tips about advocacy: never ask a question unless you know the answer. That's not entirely sure. The truly inspirational advocates, and I've seen Master Carlyle do this more than once, you can develop and do develop an instinct sometimes, and you can and do know sometimes when you can ask that question where the answer's unknown. But on the whole, that's one of the reflections that you will need to carefully assess. So I'm only saying this because I thought very carefully, adducing evidence from a police officer beginning of a murder trial. I thought I'd reflected, nice for the jury to hear a voice other than mine. So let's ask the officer to give us the words of the caution. So, officer, what words did you use? He got them all wrong. Defence counsel, possibly trying to help, possibly not, also got them all wrong. The judge weighed in thinking, right, okay, I'm going to sort this out, got it all wrong. It was down to a juror who, in the end, said, are these the words that you used, officer? Never, ever underestimate a jury. So the words are from the police caution, and then my little bit afterwards, make advocacy matter. Words do matter, and it is our job as advocates to make the words we use matter. Last autumn, I was chairing a discussion about the work of some well-known international charities, all terribly amicable. And then everyone was agreeing that advocacy was a really good thing, and we all needed to be advocating for change. And then a very well-known participant, whose name I won't use, changed the tone totally and said he had no time for advocacy. What his charity did internationally was deliver. So not advocacy, delivery. And yes, of course, it's a different context, but it's an interesting distinction, and not one that we as advocates in the courts can adopt, because to deliver results, we have to advocate. And of course, that can start way, way before the courtroom, in pre-hearing engagements, pleadings, conferences, negotiations, behaviours in the robing room. One of the most effective advocates that I ever saw in action was someone who absolutely could work the robing room, gave the impression that he was paying no heed, no attention to what was going on around him, and yet was absolutely shaping directions of travel. Advocacy has been seen as an art, a science, a psychological construct, a manipulation, an inherent talent, a skill that can be learned, and so much more. And undoubtedly, it is worthwhile trying to work out and understand what advocacy is best described at, but that's for another day. Where I would like to turn is to this little book, Duty and Art in Advocacy, by the Honourable Sir Malcolm Hilbery, a former treasurer of this inn. Not because I'm suggesting that you all run off and read it, because it is very much of its time, and it was published in 1946, so you get a flavour of its time from that. But because this has enormous personal importance for me. This was the book with which I was presented when I... And what it has in the front is presented by the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn to Elwen Evans on the occasion of her call to the bar, Trinity Term 1980, and it's signed by Elwen Jones, who was the treasurer at that time. And in fact, on the bencher's landing, there is a very splendid painting of Lord Elwen Jones. Welsh-speaking Welshman from Llanelli, was Lord Chancellor, and of course we've had another recent Lord Chancellor from Llanelli, but more significantly perhaps tonight it's right to acknowledge that the Vice-Treasurer also comes from beyond the Lycha, which for those of you who may not know the geography of Wales means that she comes from Llanelli as well. A town with an inordinately strong legal tradition. Master Elwen Jones' motto as a member of the House of Lords is one that absolutely resonates with me, and I suspect would resonate with many of you. His motto was in Welsh, so I'll say it in Welsh. Gwna dy orau. And I know that there's one person here at least who speaks Welsh, because I spoke to them in Welsh before, but gwna dy orau is do your best. Very good motto. But this book is really important for me because it was what I was given when I was called. And what a proud moment that was for me. And not something that I had really thought that I would have achieved. Can I just have a little digression for the moment onto matters Welsh? Wales is devolved. And this is just in case when you come to practice, some of you practice a little bit in Wales. Please recognise that calling it a principality, although several people still do, is not a good idea. It isn't. It is a very proud, independent country with a complex devolution settlement. And so, just as a little passing warning, the criminal justice system is not devolved, but there is much in legislation that is different. So childcare, housing, devolved tribunals. If you're doing work in Wales, just check so that you don't find yourselves inadvertently not realising the complexity of that jurisdiction that you're appearing in. So I've said that this is of its day, but there is something which for me is really, really important in the title: Duty and Art in Advocacy. It starts with duty in advocacy and then onto the art of the advocacy. And I think there's something very powerful in that sequence. So the first part is about the duty. And that's really where we should be starting as advocates, with the duties, the obligations, the ethics, the standards that are expected of those of us who are put in the privileged position of being advocates. And then we move on to the second part of the book, which is about the art of advocacy. And I'd just like to share one or two little extracts from it. When I say it's of its day, I hope that none of you will recognise the following description. Day by day in the courts, you will see barristers addressing the court as if they were engaged in a casual conversation in a club smoking room, no less, with a fellow member for whom they had little regard. Hands in trouser pockets, lolling back on desks behind, apparently weak, listless, and indifferent. As I say, I don't think that those descriptions will apply to any of you today, but they do show how important those decisions about how you start, how you speak, how you stand, how you present yourselves are. So, some personal reflections. And these are entirely personal reflections. I've been involved in advocacy training from a very, very long time ago. And as I say, it's essential in advocacy training to have do's and don'ts and recommendations as to how you approach things. This is a rather broader set of ideas just for reflection. These are the sorts of key elements that I think one needs to reflect upon. Preparation, presentation, politeness, professionalism. And I'm also going to add two softer concepts to that of empathy and well-being. Preparation, sometimes in the past, years ago, when I was talking about advocacy training, I used to say, actually, there were 3 Ps: preparation, preparation, preparation. And that is really at the heart of being an effective advocate. You read, you analyze, you have a plan, but you have to be adaptable. You have to, sometimes we describe it as 360-degree chess. If I'm going to do that, that's going to allow them to do the other. If I ask this question, that's opening the floodgates to this point. You've got to be thinking all the time, what's going to be the potential consequence of this line I'm taking and how I'm doing it? I always remember one judge on the Welsh circuit saying that it wasn't the words I'd used, but the way I'd spoken that had put the character of my client in the days when those steps were taken in that way. You need to look around corners. You need to think on your feet. I mean, it sounds a really tall order, doesn't it? But it's incredible how quickly you as reflective advocates will become able to maneuver your way through all of those sometimes competing but incredibly important elements. You know, the trouble is, you see, once one starts talking about these things, there are always those tempting examples to give. But let me just stick with these for a moment, and if we have time, come back to those tempting examples. Although I think in terms of preparation, Master Pitchford, I always remember in a case he was leading me. It was a case that went on for months. The paperwork, it was in the days of papers, filled rooms in the Crown Court. And he found just one little sentence at the bottom of one sheet of paper which said, this form was printed on such and such a date. So the form was printed on such and such a date. It had been completed by a customs officer and dated before the form had been printed. Didn't really make that much difference to the overall shape of the case, but the jury didn't like it. And just that one little sentence, I suspect, we never know because we don't get the opportunity to ask the jury why they came to the decisions they did, but that one sentence, I suspect, led to a not guilty verdict in a very serious case. Preparation. Presentation, that's all about finding your own style, but one that's effective and works. Politeness, that's one I've sometimes got horribly wrong. And still I'm afraid do. But there is actually one thing in that book that I was referring to earlier, which is absolutely current. And towards the end of the book, what appears is this. The most deadly cross-examination is invariably the most courteous. It can damage the witness beyond repair or destroy him without awakening the sympathy that will suggest excuses for him. You will lead far more witnesses to destruction than you will ever drive. And there is a great deal of truth in that. Professionalism. So preparation, presentation, politeness, professionalism. It is a job. Oh, it's one that I suspect most of us feel absolutely passionate about, but it is a job. And indeed, on the way up from Swansea today, I got an email, and it was referring back to a case that I'd prosecuted 10 years ago. Time flies, I didn't realise. It was a case in Machynlleth where a little girl called April Jones had gone missing. The defendant was Bridger. It was one of these absolutely awful cases. In fact, the sense of evil was so palpable that the house where things happened was knocked down immediately after the conviction. And some of the detail was absolutely appalling. And I received this email saying, would I be engaged in a programme reflecting on what had happened? And of course, there's a whole school of discipline for us around engaging with the media as well. But that isn't the purpose I raise it. The purpose I raise it is that it is ultimately a professional obligation that you detach yourselves emotionally from the cases you are doing. Because if you don't, you're doomed. Because if you take these things home with you, it will corrode your life. So professionalism is incredibly important. Empathy. Being able to read people and situations, read motives, doesn't mean you're empathizing with people such as the defendant in that case I've just mentioned, but being able to read and understand people. And for me, one of the rather strange things about moving from practice largely, although I still do some cases and I still sit, but to a leadership role in a university, is how transferable our skills as advocates are. And one of those skills is being able to read people, being empathetic and understanding. Never be patronizing. And the other soft skill, which I think is incredibly important, and we underrate sometimes and underplay because, my goodness, we're tough barristers and we're advocates and we're all right, is our well-being. And that really ties back to that point that I just made about being able to park cases. My description of it is wrapping them up in a box and putting them somewhere in my mind until I need to open that box again and come back to it. Often, and I'm checking the time, am I all right for time at the moment? Yes, all right. The best way sometimes of learning is by reflecting on one's own mistakes. And my goodness, have I made many of those. One likes to think that by reflecting that one will learn and one will improve. I can't say that I've always followed my own advice on that. I can be too dramatic. And I said earlier, that histrionic style, which in fact this book talks about and says that's a good way to be, isn't the way to be now. And I think one of the things that hurt me most was a fellow Girtonian, actually. I was appearing in front of her, not Lady Hale, but another fellow Girtonian. And I'd sort of forgotten there wasn't a jury in the room. It was a child death case. And I don't know how often she said to me, "I'm not a jury." And that's so true. You have to pitch it right, in the right way, in the right place. And when you're addressing a judge, when you're addressing the Court of Appeal, and my goodness, the Court of Appeal is a really difficult court, because every time I have ever appeared in front of the Court of Appeal, they've always found a left field question to ask. You think you've prepared it, you think you've got all the answers, you think you absolutely are going to be on solid ground, and I never have been. So anyway, that's a whole little digression, not really pointed in the direction of the Vice-Treasurer. But too dramatic I absolutely can be, and that's really not not the style which possibly is the most effective now. I practiced during the time when one could see the style changing from that more florid approach to that much more pared down approach. And so that's certainly one of my many mistakes. Another one is too much movement. I move my hands too much, I walk around too much, I knock pieces of paper on the floor too much, and indeed, in most courts in which I practice, if the ushers see me coming, they run to make sure that the glasses of water and the carafes of water are removed, because they know if they leave them anywhere near me, they're all going to be everywhere. And on one occasion, they ended up on some rather important exhibits, but that's a whole other story. And the other thing, which I've already just touched on, is that I have been, over the years, much too aggressive. I have been much too defensive. And, you know, I reflect and think, is that because when I started practicing, it was largely a man's world? You know, there's no getting away from that. And so sometimes, perhaps, in order to position oneself and protect oneself in that environment, one became overly defensive or unnecessarily aggressive. It really isn't the best way of winning cases. Oh, occasionally you may need to just judge and pitch a fairly forceful question, but ultimately, especially in cross-examination, if you think, if I cross-examine, I'm going to get them to admit that they're telling lies, it doesn't happen that way. I don't know, if one went round this room and asked how many times have we, as we would think, wonderful cross-examiners, managed to achieve that, it's not often. What really you're doing in cross-examination is setting out your stall, setting up your argument, and you can do that effectively without aggression. A very dear friend of mine, who actually was in Fitzwilliam when I was in Girton, so I used to cycle past his college on a daily basis, and was a silk against whom I did many, many cases, and is a senior judge, used to try and protect me from myself. Rather than the red mist coming down, he said, you could always see when I was getting cross because I would be going red up my neck. And he said he'd have a look at that. And he just tried to grab hold of me and pull me down to try and sort of shut me up. And it never really quite worked. The more he tried to tug my gown, the more I tended to ignore him. Absolutely, temper or being angry, emotion, leave it out. Absolutely leave it out of your advocacy. And if I've achieved nothing else today other than sharing with you that reflection on what you need to learn from yourselves. We are a very proud profession. We are very proud of both the duty and the art of advocacy. But remember, not everyone thinks the same. You will often be asked, if you haven't already, how can you represent someone who's guilty? How can you represent someone who's evil or parasitic or sexually exploitative? What's it like to be a hired gun? Remember I said earlier, as part of our job, is we are paid. And members of the public sometimes don't quite get the distinctions which we think we can explain and justify because we understand that duty as well as the art of the advocate. Being an advocate will make you cynical. And again, that's an advocate's sort of judgment call, isn't it? Is it can? Is it will? But those are the sorts of estimates, reflections that you will make in judging how your words matter. But yes, it will make you cynical. It can make you appear as though you don't have your own views, because one of the key skills, of course, is being able to argue each side of an argument, not just two sides, but however many other sides there are to the argument. And of course, our total independence, our ability to argue cases from every which direction, sometimes makes us appear to people, the public, as paid guns with no moral compass other than picking up the money at the end of the case. But we know that that is not the advocacy that we aspire to or practice. If we believe passionately in the rule of law, as I suspect every single one of us here does, and believe passionately in the rule of law as the foundation of a free and democratic society, then advocacy matters. Our words matter. Anything you do say matters. And so, fellow, and I hope future members of Gray's Inn, make your advocacy matter. Reflect on it, build on it. And may I return to the words of the treasurer who called me to the bar of this inn. Guna dy orau. Do your best, because if you do, you're unlikely to fall short. Got rid of me, but I think there were some questions and answers. So, yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we've got a roving mic. I don't know if that's Mike that he's holding or whether he's called Mike, but roving he is. There we are. I think there's a gentleman to the front here. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for your reflections. Just a question arising from your presentation. I'm wondering if you'd say that there's a tension between professionalism, which you say requires detachment, and empathy.
That's such a fabulous question. That really is excellent. So, is there a distinction between professionalism and empathy? I think that is one of those, as you said it yourself, tensions. When I was saying that it seems to me that the whole time in finding our way through advocacy, we are balancing different competing elements. You remember I used that example about the confidence and the overconfidence. It's constant iteration and balance. And absolutely there can be a tension between those two elements of professionalism and empathy. And actually, can I use an example which goes back to the case I was just mentioning, that April Jones case. When it came to the family's impact statement at the end of the case, it's probably the single most powerful document I have ever read or seen. And the judge wanted me to read it publicly, and he gave me time to do that, to read through it and harden myself to it over lunch. But that was an absolute example of empathy, emotion, absolutely being incredibly difficult to control professionally, but I am pleased to say that the professionalism won out, because when I did read through it, you know, in front of the media and the court and the family who'd written it and so on, I did so without emotion. But it can be a difficult call. Excellent question, thank you. Gentlemen, yeah. Well, I'd do the same were it not for the fact that apparently they're trying to record this. I hope not. Yes. It's a word I use because in that. Again, I keep on forgetting what wonderful questions colleagues such as yourselves ask. Again, that is a terrific question. Yes, I think advocacy, styles of advocacy are constantly evolving because at the end of the day, there is no point in having advocacy styles that are set in aspect. They have to be ready and suited to your audience. Now, okay, I'm not saying that judges are set in aspic. Ooh, that wouldn't do, and I'm not suggesting for a moment they are. But certainly when it comes to juries, one needs to be very aware of the sort of media, the sort of engagement that is the way we now communicate. It's much more direct, it's much punchier, it's much more accompanied by visuals. So yes, there is very definitely a change in style, and we are unquestionably going in that direction. And at the end of the day, when we talk about iterations and balances, then those are exactly the sorts of things that we need to be looking at, whilst constantly reminding ourselves of the duty of the advocate. And that's why I put that. However old-fashioned that book is, the fact that it puts duty first is all important. Because if you put the duty first, then the style you adopt and the way you present it can adapt to the world it's addressing. There's a gentleman over here.
Thank you. So just on the subject of duty, have you ever felt a clear tension between your duty to your client and your duty to the profession?
I can genuinely say no. And I think that's because I had the benefit of working with wonderful colleagues from an early stage. And, I am going to make a call out, goodness, that dates me as well, to Master Carlisle. Having done a pupillage in One Brick Court, which, where one was absolutely put on the right pathway. I went to Chester to a set of chambers which was absolutely imbued with those duties of the profession. And so if there was ever something, and it's being able to call it out, it's knowing if there is there a tension here? How am I going to handle it? So you ask people, you ask their advice, you talk it through with them. And on occasions, if I felt that there was a difficult call to be made, I would ring the Bar Council advice line. I would always make sure that if those potential tensions were in place, those elephant traps, that I was addressing them, considering them, talking through them. So ultimately, yes, of course, there's always going to be a tension. But ultimately, did I feel that I was put in an impossible, difficult position? No. Yes, of course, there are cases where a client may have said something that has led to me withdrawing from the case, for example. But that was what had to be done because that was where the duty led me. So, of course, it's something that we encounter very, very regularly as professionals in whatever sphere of practice you are in. But I think with that firm eye on probity, propriety, ethics, the duty, you won't go far wrong. I think there's just one more question.
I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned briefly media interest in cases, and I was wondering, do you think public interest makes advocates better or worse? And how does that conflict with the duty you have in that case?
My goodness, that's a fabulous question. I'm not even going to answer that. But thank you very, very much.